I remember the taste of the air on Tertius 9, thick with promethium fumes and the acrid bite of lasfire residue. It coated your tongue like oil, made every breath a conscious effort, a reminder that you were still alive in a place designed to kill you. The recruiters never mentioned that in their speeches back on the agri-world where I grew up. They talked about glory, about serving the Emperor, about the honor of defending humanity against the darkness. They showed us picked feeds of heroes standing triumphant on conquered worlds, their lasguns raised high, their faces noble and clean. They never showed us the mud. They never showed us the waiting. Tertius 9 was what the Administratum designated as a secondary theater of strategic minimal significance, which meant, in the language real soldiers used, that we were forgotten. The world itself was a ball of grey stone and rust-colored dust, orbiting a dying star that gave off light the color of old blood. There were no cities left to fight over, no resources worth the fuel to extract them, just trenches, just bunkers carved into dead rock, just us and the enemy, locked in a war that nobody remembered starting and nobody knew how to end. Command told us we were holding the line. What line? Against what threat? For what purpose? Those questions earned you a commissar's attention, and that was attention no one wanted. I arrived with the 47th Khalistan Infantry Regiment, though by the time we made planetfall half our number had already died in the void crossing. Warp sickness took some. A malfunction in the Jella fields took others. I still hear their screaming sometimes in the quiet moments between bombardments. The rest died the way soldiers always die in transit: accidents, disease, despair. We lost 300 men before we ever saw the enemy. The officers recorded it all in their data slates with the same expression they used for inventory counts. Acceptable losses. Operational parameters maintained. The Emperor protects. The trench system we inherited from the previous regiment, I never learned which one. Their records were corrupted or lost, stretched for approximately 40 kilometers along what the maps called the Meridian Ridge. It was a network of interconnected tunnels and firing positions carved into the bedrock, reinforced with rockcrete and plasteel where materials had been available, shored up with wooden beams and prayer where they had not. The walls wept moisture constantly, a rusty seepage that stained everything it touched and left your uniform stiff with mineral deposits. Mold grew in the deeper sections, black and purple varieties that the Medicae warned us not to touch, though of course we touched them anyway because there was nowhere else to put your hands when you were crawling through the dark. I was assigned to Firebase Secundus 7, a bunker complex housing approximately 200 men from various regiments that had been ground down and reformed into composite units. We had Khalistan infantry like myself, Vostroyan survivors who refused to speak about what happened to their regiment, a handful of Mordian Iron Guard who maintained their parade discipline even in the filth, and scattered remnants from worlds I'd never heard of and would never see. We spoke different dialects, worshipped the Emperor with different rituals, measured time by different calendars, but we all knew the sound of incoming artillery. We all knew the smell of gangrene. We all knew that we would die here, eventually, in ways that would never be recorded or remembered. The days on Tertius 9 lasted 28 standard hours, but we stopped counting after the first month. Time became measured in shifts. 4 hours on watch, 8 hours in the barracks if you were lucky, then back to the firing step. The night when it came was absolute. The dying star provided almost no illumination after it set, and command forbade artificial lighting in the forward positions for fear of drawing enemy fire. So we learned to move by touch, to navigate by memory, to exist in darkness so complete it felt physical, like being buried alive in black wool. The only light came from the distant flash of artillery impacts, brief and brilliant, painting the world in stark shadows before plunging it back into deeper darkness than before. The enemy, we called them the adversary, because command had never bothered to give them an official designation, held the opposite ridge. They had their own trenches, their own bunkers, their own artillery. Sometimes we could see them moving in their lines, distant figures in the red twilight. They looked human, or human enough. They wore armor of a different cut and carried weapons that made different sounds, but the fundamentals were the same. They bled, they died, they suffered. I wondered sometimes if they had recruiters who lied to them too, if they had boys from farm worlds who thought they were going to be heroes. I wondered if they tasted the same air, thick with promethium and death, and if they hated it as much as I did. The fighting followed patterns that became as familiar as breathing. Every 3 days, their artillery would begin at approximately 0400 hours, a sustained bombardment lasting anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours. We would huddle in the deepest bunkers, pressed against the rockcrete walls, feeling the impacts through the stone like the heartbeat of an angry god. The sound was physical, a pressure that squeezed your chest and made your teeth ache. Dust would rain from the ceiling, and sometimes the lights would fail, and you would sit in darkness listening to the world trying to kill you, wondering if the next shell would be the one that collapsed your section of the trench and buried you alive. When the bombardment lifted, we had perhaps 5 minutes before their infantry assault began. You learned to recognize the silence that meant death was coming. It was different from normal quiet. It had a quality of anticipation, of indrawn breath. Then the whistles would sound across the no man's land between our positions, and they would come, hundreds of them, sometimes thousands, running across the broken ground in their ragged lines, screaming prayers to whatever gods they served. We would man the firing steps, and we would kill them. Last fire flickered in the darkness like heat lightning, and the air filled with the distinctive crack hiss of last bolts finding flesh. They would fall in heaps, and still they would come, clambering over their own dead, close enough that you could see their faces in the muzzle flash, close enough that you could hear them crying for their mothers. Sometimes they reached our trenches. Then it was knives and bayonets and sharpened entrenching tools, fighting in darkness broken only by the occasional grenade flash. I killed my first man with a lasgun butt to the face, heard his nose break, felt the hot spray of his blood on my hands. My second I shot at point-blank range, so close his uniform caught fire from the last bolt. My third I don't remember clearly. It was a confusion of movement and screaming, and when the light returned he was dead at my feet with my bayonet in his throat. The commissars called it heroic. I called it survival. There's no glory in the darkness. Only the desperate animal need to keep breathing. We would drive them back, always. Then came the counter-battery fire, our own artillery responding, pounding their positions while we collected our dead and reinforced our damaged sections. The wounded were taken to the Medicae bunker in the rear, those who were expected to survive. At least, the others received the Emperor's mercy, a last bolt to the head and a shallow grave in the designated cemetery trenches behind the second line. We didn't have time for proper burial rituals. We didn't have the materials for coffins or markers. We just laid them in the ground and covered them over, and tried not to think about how many layers of dead men we were standing on. My squad leader was a man named Venko, a Khalistan like myself, but from the northern Hives, where they spoke with an accent that made basic low Gothic sound almost melodious. He had survived 8 months on Tertius 9, which made him practically ancient by our standards. Most men lasted 6 weeks before they were killed, wounded, or transferred to punishment battalions for some infraction against military law. Venko had a way of moving through the trenches that suggested he'd become part of them, as if he'd grown there like the mold. He taught me how to keep my lasgun functioning in the moisture, how to sleep in 4-minute increments, how to recognize the sound of different artillery calibers by their whistle. He taught me which sections of trench to avoid during bombardments because they always collapsed. He taught me which officers could be trusted and which ones would get you killed through stupidity or malice. Don't think about the purpose, he told me during my second week, after I'd made the mistake of asking why we were holding this particular stretch of worthless rock. Purpose is for generals and administorum clerks. You think about the next shift. You think about keeping your weapon clean. You think about the man standing next to you. Everything else is just noise. He said this while we were filling sandbags with the rust-colored dirt that passed for soil on Tertius 9, piling them up to reinforce a section that had been damaged in the previous assault. His hands moved with automatic efficiency, scoop and fill and tie, scoop and fill and tie, while his eyes never stopped scanning the horizon for threats. "The Emperor protects," he added, with the tone of a man reciting a formula he no longer believed but couldn't bring himself to abandon. "But he expects you to protect yourself too." The rations came up from the depot every 4 days, delivered by servitors that trudged through the communication trenches with their mechanical precision, heedless of the danger. Corpse starch mostly, pressed into bars that tasted of recycled protein and industrial lubricant. Sometimes we got actual food, canned vegetables from some agri-world, or processed meat that might have been grox or might have been something else. We learned not to ask questions. We learned not to complain. The punishment for complaining about rations was reduced rations, and hunger was worse than bad taste. We ate our corpse starch, and we thanked the Emperor for his provision, and we tried not to think about what went into it, or who might have contributed their biomass to our daily sustenance. Water was almost worse than food. It came from recyclers that drew moisture from the air and filtered it through systems that had been installed decades ago and maintained poorly ever since. It tasted of metal and chemicals, and sometimes you could see particles floating in it that the Medicae assured us were harmless. Men got sick anyway. Dysentery swept through the firebase in my 3rd week, leaving half of us too weak to stand watch. We manned the firing steps anyway, because the enemy didn't care if you had bloody flux. They attacked on schedule, as predictable as clockwork, and you either fought or you died. Some men managed both, fighting until they literally collapsed and died of dehydration in the trenches, still clutching their lasguns. There was a chapel in the bunker complex, carved out of natural rock and decorated with whatever materials the troops could scavenge. Someone had painted an aquila on the wall using what I suspected was human blood mixed with rust water. Candles made from rendered fat flickered in niches, and a battered icon of the Emperor, his face worn smooth by generations of desperate hands touching it, occupied a crude altar. The regimental priest, Father Michael, held services twice weekly, leading us in prayers and hymns that echoed strangely in the stone chamber. His voice was hoarse from breathing the bad air, his face gaunt from eating the same rations as the rest of us. But his faith seemed unshaken, or at least his performance of faith was convincing enough that we could pretend to share it. "The Emperor asks only that we endure," he would tell us, spreading his arms to encompass the assembled soldiers, our uniforms filthy, our faces hollow, our eyes empty. "He does not ask that we understand his plan. He does not ask that we see the purpose in our suffering. He asks only that we hold the line, that we do our duty, that we die well if we must die at all." Then he would lead us in the litany of devotion, and we would respond with voices made rough by screaming and smoke inhalation. And for a few minutes we could almost believe that what we were doing mattered, that someone beyond this forgotten rock knew our names and cared about our sacrifice. I stopped attending after the first month. It felt dishonest somehow, praying to a god who clearly had no interest in Tertius 9 or the men dying on it. Venko noticed but said nothing. He still went, still mouthed the words, still touched the icon with his calloused fingers. "It's not about belief," he told me once, when I asked why he bothered. "It's about ritual, about maintaining structure. When everything else is chaos, you need something predictable, even if it's just words you don't mean anymore." He said this matter-of-factly, while cleaning his lasgun, his hands performing the maintenance routine that had been drilled into us during training. Strip, clean, oil, reassemble, strip, clean, oil, reassemble. The prayer of the soldier. The adversary changed their tactics in my 6th week. Instead of the predictable 3-day cycle of bombardment and assault, they went silent. Days passed without incoming fire, without the whistles and the screaming charges. We manned our positions, weapons ready, waiting for an attack that didn't come. The silence was worse than the fighting. It gave you time to think, to remember, to imagine. Men started seeing things in the darkness movement where there was none, shapes that vanished when you looked directly at them. The Medicae called it combat fatigue and prescribed stims, but the stims just made you more alert to your own fear, more aware of how badly you wanted to run, how impossible escape was. On the 8th day of silence, they began the real bombardment. It started at midnight and continued for 18 hours without pause. Not the usual pattern of shells mixed with quiet periods, but sustained, overwhelming fire that reduced our positions to cratered rubble. The bunkers held, mostly, but the communication trenches collapsed in dozens of places. Men were buried alive, their screaming muffled by tons of earth and stone. We dug them out when we could, but many died before we reached them, suffocated in the darkness, alone with their terror. The ones we saved often died anyway, from internal injuries or shock, or simply from giving up. I helped pull a Vostroyan from a collapsed section, his legs crushed, his face grey with pain. He looked at me and said something in his native tongue, a prayer or a curse. I couldn't tell, and then he just stopped. His eyes stayed open, but everything behind them left, and I was holding the body of a stranger who had never learned my name. When the bombardment finally stopped, we had lost 40% of our fighting strength, without the enemy firing a single small arms shot. The commissar, a thin man named Corvinus, with eyes like chips of obsidian, walked the decimated trenches with his bolt pistol drawn, looking for cowards. He found a young trooper, couldn't have been more than 17, huddled in a crater and weeping. The boy was from my world, from the same province even, though I didn't know him personally. Corvinus shot him in the head without ceremony, without words, just a single bolt round that painted the crater wall with the boy's disbelief. The Emperor has no use for cowards, Corvinus announced to those of us who had witnessed the execution. Fear is acceptable. Surrender to fear is heresy. Then he walked on, looking for others to kill, to motivate through terror since faith had proven insufficient. The assault came that evening, in the red twilight that passed for dusk on Tertius 9. They came differently this time, not in waves but in a sustained push, using the crater field created by their bombardment as cover, advancing by bounds under covering fire from their own lines. They were better trained than we'd thought, or perhaps they'd been holding back, conserving their skilled troops for this moment. They reached our positions in force, too many to repel with small arms alone, and suddenly we were fighting for every meter of trench, every bunker, every ruined firing position. I lost track of time, lost track of how many I killed, lost track of everything, except the immediate necessity of staying alive in a world that had contracted to the length of a bayonet. Venko died somewhere in that chaos. I didn't see it happen, but I heard about it later. He'd been holding a choke point, a place where a communication trench intersected with the main firing line, keeping the enemy from flanking our position. He'd held them for 20 minutes, firing until his Lasgun's power cell was exhausted, then fighting with his knife, then with his hands. When reinforcements finally reached him, they found him dead, surrounded by enemy corpses, his fingers still locked around the throat of the man who'd killed him. They pulled him free and threw his body on the pile with the others. And that was the end of Venko. 8 months of survival and skill and hard-won knowledge, buried in a mass grave with no marker and no record of his name. We held the line, barely. By dawn, we'd pushed them back to their starting positions, but the cost had been terrible. Firebase Secundus 7 had lost over 60% of its complement. My squad was down to 3 men, including myself. The trenches were clogged with bodies, ours and theirs, mixed together in death the way they'd been mixed in combat. The smell was overwhelming, sweet and putrid, a stench that seemed to coat the inside of your lungs and linger there, no matter how deeply you breathed. The corpse detail worked for 3 days clearing the bodies, dragging them to the disposal pits where they were doused with promethium and burned, the black smoke rising in columns that could probably be seen from orbit if anyone was looking. They brought up replacements from the depot, fresh conscripts who looked at the trenches with the same mixture of fear and denial I'd felt 2 months earlier. I was assigned a new squad, given Venko's position by virtue of having survived, which seemed to be the primary qualification for leadership in this hell. The new men looked to me for guidance, for wisdom, for some assurance that they would survive. I had nothing to give them. I taught them how to keep their weapons clean, how to sleep in short increments, how to recognize the sound of incoming artillery. I taught them which sections to avoid during bombardments. I taught them not to think about the purpose, to focus on the next shift, the next meal, the next breath. Everything Venko had taught me, passed on to a new generation of the damned. The Administratum records showed that Firebase Secundus 7 had held its position with acceptable losses, operational parameters maintained, strategic objectives achieved. The Emperor protects. Nothing about the men who'd died screaming in collapsed bunkers, or the ones who'd been burned with the enemy dead because there was no time to sort them out, or the young trooper from my world whose crime was being too afraid to hide it. Just numbers in a data slate, filed away in some archive on some world I would never see, meaningless to everyone except the men who'd lived them, and we were dying too fast to remember. The monsoon season started in my 3rd month, though monsoon was probably too generous a term for what amounted to intermittent rain that fell like cold needles and turned the trenches into rivers of contaminated mud. The water pooled in the lower sections, rising to knee depth in some areas, and you couldn't avoid it. You had to wade through it to reach your position, feeling the cold seep through your boots, your socks, your skin, until your feet were permanently numb and starting to rot. Trench foot became epidemic. The Medicae set up a station where they cut away the necrotic tissue and painted the wounds with antiseptic that burned like liquid fire. But there wasn't enough medicine to go around, and men died of infections that should have been treatable, their bodies giving up because they'd already endured too much. I developed a cough in the 4th month that never went away. A wet, rattling sound that I could feel in my chest like something alive trying to escape. The Medicae gave me tablets that made my head feel stuffed with wool but didn't stop the coughing. Everyone had it, or something like it. Respiratory diseases thrived in the moisture and close quarters, passing from man to man regardless of precaution. We coughed up blood and mucus, the color of rust water, spat it into the mud, and continued our shifts because there was no alternative. The sick list was meaningless when everyone was sick. You only got pulled from duty if you physically couldn't stand, and even then they'd prop you in a firing position with your lasgun and tell you to watch your sector. The enemy developed a new weapon during this period, a kind of mortar that fired shells that burst in the air above our trenches and released a gas that smelled like rotten fruit and burned your lungs if you breathed it. We had gas masks, ancient things made of rubber and plastic that leaked around the seals and fogged up until you were effectively blind. Wearing them during an assault was nightmare. You couldn't see clearly, couldn't breathe properly, couldn't communicate except by hand signals nobody remembered because nobody expected to use them. Men tore their masks off to see or breathe and died choking, their lungs filling with fluid, their faces turning blue. I kept mine on, stumbled through the fog half blind, fired at shapes that might have been enemies or might have been my own men. I'll never know how many of my own I killed in that chaos. The gas dissipated after an hour, but the memory of suffocating inside my own mask stayed with me, the feeling of the world shrinking to the tiny circle of fogged plastic and the sound of my own panicked breathing. Letters from home stopped coming around this time. Not just mine, everyone's. The supply servitors still arrived with rations and ammunition, but the mail had ceased. Maybe the transport ship had been destroyed in the warp. Maybe the Administratum had simply decided that maintaining postal service to a forgotten front was an inefficient use of resources. Maybe there was no longer anyone left to write to us from the worlds we'd left behind. We didn't know, and there was no way to find out. Men who'd clung to old letters like holy relics, reading them until the paper fell apart, suddenly had nothing to remind them that there had ever been anything beyond Tertius 9. Some adapted. Others withdrew into themselves, becoming silent and mechanical, performing their duties with the blank efficiency of servitors. I'd had a sister back on my agri world, younger than me by 4 years, Maris. She used to write to me during the early months, chattering letters about the harvest and the neighbors and her plans to become a teacher. Her handwriting was careful and precise, each letter formed with the concentration of someone still learning. I'd read those letters so many times I'd memorized them. could recite passages in my head while I stood watch in the darkness. When the mail stopped, I felt something fundamental break inside me. The last connection to who I'd been before the Imperium had reshaped me into a weapon. I wondered if she remembered me. I wondered if she'd received notification of my death. They probably assumed anyone deployed to Tertius 9 was dead, and they wouldn't have been far wrong. I wondered if she cried, or if she just accepted it the way we all accepted everything the Imperium demanded of us. The Commissar, Corvinus, disappeared in the 5th month. No announcement, no explanation. He was there during morning inspection, executing a trooper for having a fouled weapon, and then he simply wasn't there anymore. Rumors spread through the trenches like disease. He'd been recalled to the regimental headquarters. He'd been killed by a sniper. He'd deserted. He'd been revealed as a heretic and executed himself. Nobody knew the truth, and nobody dared to ask the officers. A new commissar arrived within days. A woman this time, her name Delara, her face carrying the distinctive ritual scarring of someone from a Schola Progenium. She was, if anything, more ruthless than Corvinus had been, conducting executions with a cold precision that made his arbitrary violence seem almost merciful by comparison. She caught me once, between shifts, sitting in a supply alcove and staring at nothing. "On your feet, soldier," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut. I stood, automatically, years of conditioning, overriding the exhaustion that had settled into my bones. She studied me with eyes that seemed to see through flesh, to whatever was left of my soul. "You've been here 6 months, she said, somehow knowing this without checking any records. "That's long enough to either become strong or break. Which are you?" "I'm still here, Commissar," I said, which wasn't really an answer. She smiled, and it was worse than her anger would have been. "Being here isn't the same as being strong. I've seen men's bodies continue fighting days after their spirits died. Empty uniforms with weapons, going through the motions, already dead but too stubborn to fall down." She stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the strange perfume she wore, something floral that had no place in this hell of mud and death. "The Emperor needs warriors, not corpses. Tell me, are you still fighting, or just waiting to die?" I wanted to tell her that I'd been waiting to die since my first week, that every man on Tertius 9 was already a corpse, that she was talking to a ghost. But commissars didn't want honesty, they wanted affirmation. They wanted you to mouth the words that allowed them to believe the war was righteous and the sacrifice meaningful. So I said, "I'm fighting, Commissar, for the Emperor." The words tasted like ash, but they satisfied her. She nodded, once, and moved on to terrorize someone else, leaving me with the understanding that even despair had to be hidden, that showing the truth of what we'd become was itself a form of heresy. The war continued. Of course it continued. There was never any question that it would continue. The enemy launched their assaults with predictable regularity, modified their tactics based on what had worked before, adapted to our defenses as we adapted to their attacks. It was a dance, macabre and pointless, each side trying variations on the theme of inflicting death, neither side capable of delivering a decisive blow. The line barely moved. Meters gained in blood were lost again in blood, and the trenches themselves became monuments to futility, every meter of earth consecrated by the fluids of dying men, until the ground itself seemed to be composed more of corpses than soil. I lost count of how many men I'd killed. It stopped mattering. They all had faces, but the faces blurred together after a while, became a generic enemy, a target, a problem to be solved with a last bolt to center mass. I stopped wondering if they had families, if they'd been lied to by their recruiters, if they wanted to be heroes. They became less than human to me, because that was the only way to keep killing them, to keep doing what the Imperium demanded without losing whatever small piece of myself I still possessed. Dehumanize the enemy, make them monsters, make their deaths necessary and righteous. It was a trick, a psychological survival mechanism, but it worked. I slept better when I slept at all, once I stopped seeing them as people and started seeing them as obstacles to be removed. The trenches themselves evolved, shaped by the war into a kind of ecosystem of violence. You could trace the history of the conflict in the layers of reinforcement, the patches and repairs that marked where breakthroughs had been contained, where assaults had reached their high watermark before being pushed back. Some sections had been held by the same regiment for years, their names and unit designations carved into support beams, their dead buried in the walls themselves, mixed in with the rockcrete and rubble. Other sections changed hands regularly, the fighting so intense that permanent fortification was impossible, leaving only crater fields and improvised positions that would be defended desperately and then abandoned when the situation became untenable. In my 7th month, they pulled our depleted regiment back from the firing line and sent us to the reserve trenches, 3 kilometers behind the front, for what they called rest and refit. This consisted of being issued new uniforms to replace the ones that had rotted on our bodies, receiving replacement equipment for what had been lost or broken, and spending our days filling sandbags and reinforcing positions we might have to defend if the line collapsed. It wasn't rest in any meaningful sense. We still stood watches, still drilled, still listened to the distant rumble of artillery, and knew that we'd be back there soon enough. But it was distance, a few kilometers of space between us and the immediate prospect of death, and that was enough to seem like luxury. There was a canteen in the reserve area, a bunker where you could buy actual alcohol with the scrip we were issued instead of pay. The prices were criminal, a month's scrip for a bottle of something that might have been amasec or might have been industrial solvent with coloring added, but men paid anyway, desperate for anything that would let them feel something other than fear or numbness. I spent my scrip on a bottle and drank it in a corner, while other soldiers talked and laughed with a hysteria that had nothing to do with humor. The alcohol burned going down, settled in my stomach like acid, and eventually produced a kind of fog that made the world soft around the edges. I understood why men drank. Oblivion was preferable to awareness, when awareness meant truly comprehending where you were and what you'd become. I met a man in the canteen, a trooper from the 12th Caribbean Rangers, his uniform bearing evidence of fighting in the northern sectors where the war was allegedly even worse than our portion of it. He had burn scars across the left side of his face, the skin shiny and tight, his ear reduced to a melted stub. We sat together in silence for a while, 2 damaged men with nothing to say, and then he asked me how long I'd been on Tertius 9. 7 months, I told him. He laughed, though it sounded more like coughing. You're ancient. I've been here 19 months of this shit. He took a drink from his own bottle, some kind of local distillation that smelled like machine oil. You know what the worst part is? Not the fighting, not the dying. It's knowing that it doesn't matter, that we could all die tomorrow and the war would continue without missing a beat, that there are probably millions of other forgotten worlds just like this one, grinding up millions of other men who thought they were going to be heroes. He stared into his bottle like he could see something there that I couldn't. The Imperium is built on bones. We're just adding our calcium to the foundation. I asked him how he'd survived 19 months, what his secret was. He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and gone dead somewhere behind the corneas. I didn't survive. This thing sitting here drinking with you, this isn't survival. This is just the body forgetting to die. The actual me, the person I was before, he's gone. Died somewhere in the 3rd month, I think, though I can't remember exactly when. What's left is just combat reflex and muscle memory, a machine made of meat that knows how to kill. He said this matter-of-factly, without self-pity, just stating an observable truth. You're probably the same, if you bothered to look close enough. We're all ghosts here, haunting our own corpses. They sent us back to the line after 2 weeks. The trenches had changed in our absence, new craters, new damage, new bodies buried in the walls. The regiment that had held the line while we rested was down to skeleton strength, their survivors hollow-eyed and twitching, clearly on the edge of breaking. We relieved them without ceremony, took our positions on the firing step, and resumed the routine of waiting and killing. It felt almost comforting in its familiarity, the return to a life where every hour might be your last, but at least you knew the parameters of your existence. Uncertainty was worse than danger. The unknown was worse than the probability of death. My new squad consisted of men I barely knew, replacements who'd arrived during our rotation to the rear. They were younger than the men who'd died, fresh conscripts who still believed in something: the Emperor, the Imperium, the righteousness of our cause. I envied them their delusions. Faith would keep them fighting longer than cynicism would, give them a reason to endure beyond simple biological imperative. But it also made them vulnerable, set them up for a harder fall when reality inevitably stripped away their illusions. I did my best to keep them alive, teaching them the small tricks that might buy an extra day or week. Most of them died anyway, because on Tertius 9 survival was ultimately a matter of luck, and luck always ran out eventually. The 8th month brought a new horror. The enemy began using incendiary weapons, shells that burst into chemical fire that stuck to whatever it touched and burned at temperatures that turned men into ash in seconds. There was no defense against it, except not being where it landed, which was impossible to predict. You'd hear the distinctive whistle of the incoming shell, different from regular high explosive, and then white-hot chemical fire would splash across the trench like liquid, consuming everything in its path. Men caught in it didn't even have time to scream. They just flared into human torches and collapsed, their bodies reduced to carbonized husks that crumbled when you tried to move them. I was caught on the periphery of one such strike, felt the heat wash over me like standing too close to a furnace, smelled my own hair singeing. I threw myself flat in the mud, the filthy water that I'd cursed for months suddenly a salvation, and lay there while the world burned around me. When it was over, half my squad was dead, their bodies blackened statues in poses of agony, and the trench itself was lined with ash that had been my friends. We couldn't bury them, there was nothing left to bury. We just swept the remains into the mud and tried not to think about which ash pile had been which person. The Commissar, Delara, seemed to take the incendiary attacks personally, as if the enemy was specifically trying to insult the Imperium by using such weapons. She began conducting more frequent inspections, looking for cowardice or insufficient zeal, and executing men with an enthusiasm that bordered on the fanatical. I watched her shoot a trooper for hesitating during an assault, putting a bolt round through his spine and leaving him paralyzed and screaming in the mud until someone else ended his suffering. "Fear is the mind killer," she announced to the survivors. "Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. You will master your fear, or I will master you." Then she stepped over the still twitching body and continued her inspection, looking for others to motivate through murder. The pattern of my existence became purely mechanical. Wake, check, weapon, stand, watch, kill enemies, eat rations, sleep if possible, repeat. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. The passage of time marked only by the slow accumulation of scars and the gradual erosion of anything resembling personality. I stopped thinking in the conventional sense, my mind becoming a series of simple decision trees: threat or not threat, cover or no cover, shoot or don't shoot. Complex thoughts became difficult, then impossible. Language felt foreign, words losing their meaning until communication with other soldiers became minimal. Just the essential grunts and gestures needed to coordinate basic actions. In my 9th month, I realized I couldn't remember my sister's name. Maris, it came to me eventually, but only after long minutes of mental searching, like trying to retrieve something dropped into deep water. I couldn't picture her face anymore, couldn't hear her voice in my memory. The letters I'd memorized had faded, the words themselves dissolving into vague impressions of meaning. I tried to feel something about this loss, grief, anger, anything, but there was nothing there, just a void where emotions used to live. I was becoming what the Caravian trooper had described, a machine made of meat, my consciousness slowly being overwritten by combat conditioning until nothing remained of the person I'd been. The enemy launched a major offensive in the 10th month, throwing what must have been tens of thousands of troops at our section of the line in a sustained assault that lasted for 3 days. They came in waves, supported by armor that we couldn't effectively fight, heavy vehicles that crushed our positions and rolled over our trenches, sealing men inside to suffocate or be buried alive. We fell back to secondary positions, then tertiary, conducting a fighting retreat that cost us meters we'd held for months. The officers screamed about holding the line, about the Emperor's will, about duty and honor. The commissars executed men for retreating without orders, then executed men for not retreating fast enough when orders came. It was chaos, pure and simple, the thin veneer of military order collapsing to reveal the fundamental anarchy underneath. I lost my entire squad in those 3 days. Not killed in combat, just lost, separated in the chaos of retreat and counterattack, dispersed into other units or dead in collapsed bunkers or simply gone, disappeared into the war's appetite for soldiers. I found myself attached to a composite unit made up of survivors from a dozen different regiments, commanded by a junior officer who looked barely old enough to shave and clearly had no idea what he was doing. We held a position that might have been strategically important or might have been completely meaningless. I couldn't tell anymore, couldn't make myself care. We fought because fighting was what we did, because the alternative was execution by our own commissars, because stopping meant dying, and something in our bodies still wanted to live, even if our minds had given up. We held. Eventually, the enemy offensive exhausted itself, their casualties mounting until even they couldn't sustain the assault. They fell back to their original positions, leaving the no man's land carpeted with their dead, and we reclaimed our shattered trenches and began the process of rebuilding them for the 100th time. The official reports probably called it a victory. It felt like slow extinction, like watching yourself bleed out and knowing there was nothing you could do to stop it, but keep bleeding anyway. The replacements that arrived after the offensive were different. They weren't fresh conscripts anymore. The Imperium must have run out of naive farm boys willing to die for empty promises. These were penal troops, men whose crimes had earned them redemption through death, their uniforms marked with the symbols of their shame. They were soldiers only in the technical sense, having been issued weapons and pointed at the enemy. They had no training, no discipline, no faith in the Emperor or the Imperium. They were just damned men being given a chance to die in a marginally more useful way than rotting in prison. I was put in charge of a squad of them, expected to turn them into effective soldiers, despite the fact that I could barely remember my own name anymore. They died faster than normal troops, their lack of training making them easy targets. But they fought with a desperation that conscripts lacked, a kind of savage intensity born from having nothing left to lose. Some of them were genuinely dangerous, criminals who'd killed before and would kill again without hesitation or remorse. Others were broken things, men who'd been destroyed by whatever circumstances had led to their convictions, now being destroyed again by the war. I stopped learning their names. There was no point. They'd be dead within days anyway, and names just made corpses harder to forget. In my 11th month, I was wounded for the first time. A piece of shrapnel from an artillery burst, a jagged bit of metal that tore through my left shoulder and lodged against bone. The medicae dug it out without anesthetic because there wasn't any left, my screaming muffled by a leather strap they put in my mouth. The wound became infected despite their efforts, my shoulder swelling and leaking pus that smelled like rotten meat. They painted it with antiseptic and gave me antibiotics that might have been past their expiration date, and eventually the infection subsided, leaving me with limited mobility in that arm and constant pain that became just another element of existence, like the cold or the hunger or the fear. The injury should have gotten me pulled from the line, should have earned me time in a rear area hospital. Instead, they declared me fit for light duty and kept me in the trenches, because bodies were bodies, and they needed everyone that could hold a weapon. I learned to shoot right-handed, compensated for the weakness in my left arm, adapted because adaptation was survival, and survival was all that mattered. The pain became familiar, almost comforting in its constancy. At least it reminded me that I was still alive, still capable of sensation, not yet completely numb to everything. Father Mikhail, The regimental priest found me in my 11th month, sitting in a bunker and staring at the wall. He'd aged visibly since I'd last paid attention to him, his face skeletal, his hands shaking with what might have been palsy or might have been simple exhaustion. "You stopped coming to services," he said, sitting beside me without asking permission. "Many do, after enough time here. The Emperor begins to seem distant when you're living in hell." "The Emperor is distant," I said, my voice rough from disuse. "Or absent, or imaginary. Does it matter which?" He should have been offended, should have reported me to the commissars for faithless speech. Instead, he just nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement that contained no argument. Perhaps, or perhaps hell is where faith is tested, where we prove our devotion by maintaining it in the absence of comfort or proof. He pulled out a small flask, offered it to me. I drank some kind of communion wine, sweet and thick, probably ancient. "I don't ask you to believe," he continued, taking the flask back and drinking himself. "I ask you to endure. That's all the Emperor truly requires, that we continue, that we persist, that we don't surrender to despair, even when despair is the only rational response." "Why?" I asked. "What's the point of enduring if the outcome is the same? We're all going to die here. This world is a meat grinder, and we're the meat. Endurance just means suffering longer before the inevitable end." "The point," he said, "is that the Imperium continues. That's all that matters in the Emperor's calculus. Not our individual survival, not our happiness or fulfillment, not even our dignity, just that the machine continues to function, that human civilization persists for another day, another century, another millennium. We are components in that machine, meant to be used and discarded as needed." He took another drink, his hand steady for the first time in the conversation. "It's not a comforting truth, but it is truth nonetheless. We endure because our endurance serves something larger than ourselves, even if we personally gain nothing from it." I wanted to argue, to rage against the cosmic injustice of being born for no purpose except to suffer and die in service to a cause I didn't understand and an emperor I'd never seen. But the energy required for argument was beyond me. I just sat there, sharing the communion wine with a priest who'd stopped believing but kept performing faith anyway, because the alternative was admitting that everything we'd endured had been for nothing. The 12th month arrived with no fanfare, no acknowledgement that I'd somehow survived a full year on Tertius 9. By the unit's standards, I was now ancient, a veteran, someone the fresh meat looked to for guidance that I was unqualified to provide. My body was breaking down in the slow way that happened when you pushed it past its design limits. My cough had worsened. My infected shoulder had never fully healed. My feet were masses of scar tissue from the trench foot and frostbite and simple abuse. I looked like a corpse that hadn't realized it was dead yet, my uniform hanging on a frame that seemed to shrink daily despite the rations. They made me a sergeant around this time, a field promotion that came with no additional pay and only the added responsibility of getting other men killed through my inevitable failures of judgment. I accepted because refusing would have meant execution, and some vestigial survival instinct still lived in my damaged body, still insisted on tomorrow even when tomorrow promised only more suffering. I took command of another squad of penal troops, taught them the basics of staying alive for 10 minutes, and watched them die in the ways I'd watched hundreds of men die before them, blown apart by artillery, burned by incendiaries, shot by snipers, crushed by armor, or simply ground down by the accumulated stress until their hearts gave out, or they ate their lasguns. The enemy launched another major offensive in the 13th month, and this time we barely held. The line contracted, compressed, whole sections of trench abandoned as we consolidated around points we could actually defend with our depleted numbers. I fought in a haze, my body moving on autopilot while my mind observed from some distant place, disconnected from the physical reality of combat. I killed efficiently, mechanically, a meat machine that processed targets and converted them to corpses. When the offensive finally collapsed, I realized I'd been fighting for 6 days without sleep, sustained by stims and desperation and the simple momentum of violence. In the aftermath, I found myself in what had once been our secondary command bunker, now serving as the primary because the original had been destroyed. The walls were covered in maps showing positions and unit strengths. Most of the information, outdated or wrong, maintained more from habit than utility. I stared at those maps and tried to understand what we were fighting for. What strategic objective justified the holocaust of young men this world had become? I couldn't find it. The maps showed nothing of value, no resources, no strategic position, no reason for either side to commit resources to this ball of dead rock. We were fighting because we had been fighting, because neither side could admit that the effort was meaningless without making the deaths meaningless retroactively. So we continued, adding corpses to the pile, maintaining the fiction that it all meant something. Commissar de Lara found me there, staring at those useless maps. "You're thinking too much, Sergeant," she said, her voice carrying that edge of threat that all commissars cultivated. "Thinking is for officers. Your job is to do." "What are we doing, Commissar?" I asked, too tired to be afraid of her bolt pistol. "What is the purpose of this?" I gestured at the maps, at the trenches beyond, at the entirety of Tertius IX's pointless war. She studied me for a long moment, her scarred face unreadable. Then, surprisingly, she answered honestly, "We're dying in an organized fashion. That's our purpose. The Imperium has infinite humans but finite resources. Here, we trade the infinite for time, bleeding the enemy until they decide that whatever they want isn't worth the cost. It's not glorious. It's not noble. It's just arithmetic. Bodies subtracted from the sum of humanity until one side or the other reaches zero first." She stepped closer, her hand resting on her bolt pistol. "But you already knew that, didn't you? You've known for months. The question is whether that knowledge makes you a coward or a fatalist. Cowards I execute. Fatalists I can use." "I'm still here," I said, the same response I'd given her the first time we'd spoken. "I'm still fighting. For now," she agreed. "But for how much longer? There's a limit to endurance, even for the strongest. I've seen it the moment when a man simply stops, when his body continues, but everything that made him human has departed. You're close to that point, Sergeant. Maybe past it. The Emperor may still have use for your body, but your soul is already gone." She said this, not cruelly but clinically, diagnosing a condition she'd observed countless times before. "When the body fails to, let me know. I'll make your death count for something, assign you to a suicide mission, let you take some of the enemy with you. It's more than most get." She left me with that comfort, the promise that my inevitable death would at least serve a tactical purpose. I should have been horrified or angry or something, but I felt nothing. She was right, everything that had made me human was gone, burned away by 12 months of mechanized slaughter. What remained was just a biological weapons platform, a system for converting ammunition into enemy casualties, a machine that would function until it broke and then be discarded like any other worn-out equipment. The 14th and 15th months blurred together, indistinguishable from each other and from all the months before. The war continued its grinding rhythm: bombardment, assault, counterattack, brief periods of quiet to clear the bodies and repair the damage, then the cycle beginning again. I led men into battle, watched them die, filled out the casualty reports with the mechanical precision of a servitor inputting data. Names stopped meaning anything. Faces became interchangeable. The only distinction that mattered was whether someone was alive or dead, and that distinction was temporary, soon to be resolved in favor of death for everyone involved. My body continued to deteriorate. The cough became constant, bringing up blood more often than not. My shoulder had developed a grinding sensation when I moved it, bone scraping against bone where the joint had been damaged. My hands shook even when I wasn't cold or afraid, a tremor that made fine manipulation difficult. I looked like the walking dead, and felt like it too. My consciousness spread thin across a failing physical form, barely present enough to maintain operational functionality. The Medicae gave up trying to treat me, their resources better spent on soldiers with a reasonable chance of recovery. I was living on borrowed time, my body having already exceeded its operational lifespan, sustained only by habit and the grim determination of meat that refused to admit it was already dead. In my 16th month, something changed. Not in the war that continued with its usual futility, but in me. The part of my mind that had been observing from a distance, watching my body perform violence while remaining emotionally disconnected, simply ceased to exist. There was no dramatic moment of realization, no psychological breaking point. It was more like a light switching off, a system shutting down when it ran out of power. What remained was purely functional, a consciousness reduced to its most basic elements: sensory input, threat assessment, tactical response. I was finally what Commissar Delara had predicted, what the war had been trying to make me all along: a biological machine, void of personhood, optimized for the single purpose of killing efficiently until killed in return. This state might have been disturbing if I'd retained enough self-awareness to be disturbed by anything. Instead, it was almost peaceful. Without the burden of personality, without the weight of memory or hope or fear, existence became simple. Problems had solutions, threats had responses. The complexity of human experience reduced to binary decisions executed with mechanical precision. I suspect this is what servitors experience, if they experience anything at all, the blessed simplicity of purpose without the confusion of consciousness. The enemy must have detected something, some shift in the character of our defense, because they intensified their attacks during this period. Perhaps our diminished capacity made us seem vulnerable, worth the effort of a concentrated assault. They threw everything at us: conventional infantry, armored vehicles, chemical weapons, incendiaries, even what appeared to be primitive aircraft that strafed our positions before being shot down by anti-air emplacements. We held, but barely, our line contracting further, consolidating around an ever-shrinking perimeter. By my 17th month, Firebase Secundus 7 controlled less than half its original defensive zone, the rest abandoned to the enemy or contested in no man's land that changed hands multiple times daily. The officers began talking about evacuation, about pulling the survivors off Tertius 9 and deploying them somewhere else, somewhere the war still mattered. I processed this information with the same emotional weight I gave to weather reports, interesting data with no personal relevance. If they evacuated us, I would go. If they ordered us to hold until death, I would hold. The decision was theirs to make, my role purely to execute whatever orders came down. Agency was a burden I no longer carried, having surrendered it to the machine of military hierarchy. And there was relief in that surrender, freedom in the absence of choice. Father Michael died in my 17th month, killed by a sniper while conducting services in the chapel. A single last bolt through the head, instant death, his blood spattering the hand-painted Aquila he'd been standing in front of. They dragged his body out and burned it with the others. No special ceremony for a priest who'd spent himself maintaining faith in a faithless place. I felt nothing at his death, no grief or anger, just the abstract recognition that a familiar element of the environment had been removed. He'd been right. In the end, endurance was all the Emperor required, and he'd endured until he couldn't anymore. His death proved nothing except that even priests were just meat, ultimately, subject to the same physics as everyone else. In the 18th month, they finally gave the evacuation order, not because command had decided we mattered enough to save, but because the front had collapsed to the point where maintaining our position was tactically impossible. We were to fall back to the evacuation zone, a fortified area near the original landing sites, and await transport off-world. The withdrawal was to be conducted in stages, maintaining contact with the enemy to prevent them from overrunning us during the retreat. It was a difficult maneuver, requiring coordination and discipline from troops who had neither, and the officers must have known that significant casualties were inevitable. But the alternative was total annihilation. So we prepared to abandon positions we'd held for years, to surrender ground that had been consecrated by uncountable deaths, to admit that all the suffering had achieved nothing except buying time that nobody wanted. The retreat began at dawn, under cover of the last sustained artillery barrage our depleted batteries could provide. We moved in stages, by squads and platoons, covering each other as we fell back through secondary and tertiary positions toward the evacuation zone. The enemy pursued, naturally, seeing opportunity in our withdrawal, pressing hard against our rearguard actions. Men died in that retreat as they died throughout the war suddenly, violently, their bodies left behind because we had no time or capacity to recover them. I led my squad through the chaos, navigating by instinct and memory through terrain I knew better than I'd ever known my homeworld, fighting when we had to, running when we could, maintaining enough coherence to remain an effective unit even as the larger regimental structure dissolved into mob of desperate soldiers, all heading in the same direction. We reached the evacuation zone after 3 days of running combat, our numbers reduced from the 200 men. Firebase Secundus 7 had held before the withdrawal to perhaps 70 survivors, all of us damaged in various ways, all of us running on empty, sustained only by the prospect of escape. The evacuation zone was a fortress in miniature, walls of prefabricated plasteel and rockcrete surrounding a landing field where transports were supposed to arrive and carry us away from Tertius 9. Supposed to. The transports hadn't come yet, and nobody could tell us when they would, or if they would at all. We settled in to wait, maintaining defensive positions, rationing the last of our supplies, and trying not to think about what would happen if the transports never came, if this was just another way to die on this forgotten world. I spent those days of waiting in a semi-conscious state, my body propped against a wall, my lasgun across my lap, my mind barely present. I wasn't sleeping, I'd forgotten how to do that properly, my sleep cycle broken by 17 months of irregular watch schedules and constant danger. I was just existing, running minimal power to conserve energy, a machine in standby mode. Other soldiers talked, made plans for what they'd do when they got off-world, told stories about homes they'd probably never see again. I didn't participate. I had nothing to say, no plans to make, no home to remember. I was a weapon, and weapons don't dream. The transports arrived on the 5th day, massive void-capable craft that descended through the red twilight like metal mountains, their engines screaming, their bulk crushing the landscape beneath their landing gear. There weren't enough of them. That became immediately obvious. They could carry perhaps half the soldiers gathered in the evacuation zone, which meant that half would be left behind. The officers began making selections, choosing who would go on the first wave based on criteria none of us understood. I didn't care whether I was selected or not, having no particular investment in my continued existence. But they called my name, or rather, my unit designation, because names had long since been replaced by serial numbers in all official capacity, and directed me toward one of the transports. The loading process was chaos, hundreds of men trying to board simultaneously, fighting for position on the embarkation ramps, officers and commissars maintaining order through threats and occasional violence. I shuffled forward with my squad, or what remained of it, moving with the flow of bodies toward the transport's vast cargo bay. Behind us, the enemy had detected the transports and was launching a final assault on the evacuation zone, artillery beginning to fall on the landing field, las fire crackling from the perimeter. The transports would leave with or without full capacity, unable to risk destruction, waiting for stragglers. Men ran for the ramps even as the loading doors began to close, some making it, others crushed when the massive doors sealed shut. I made it aboard. I don't know if that was fortunate or not. The cargo bay was packed with soldiers, all of us pressed together in the darkness, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear and the machine oil tang of the transport systems. The engines changed pitch, the whole craft shuddering as it lifted from the surface. And through the small viewports I could see Tertius 9 falling away, the trenches and bunkers that had been my world for 18 months shrinking to insignificance, then disappearing entirely as we climbed toward orbit. I felt nothing watching it recede. No relief, no triumph, No joy at escape. Just the abstract recognition that I was no longer on the surface, that this particular phase of existence had concluded, that whatever came next would be different but not necessarily better. The transport docked with a massive void ship in orbit, some kind of military transport vessel designed to carry entire regiments between war zones. We were herded from the landing craft into holding areas, vast chambers filled with bunks stacked 6 high, assigned numbers and locations through a process that felt more like inventory management than troop movement. The ship was crowded, packed with soldiers from dozens of different campaigns, all of us being shuffled around the galaxy to wherever command decided we were needed next. Nobody told us where we were going. Nobody asked. We'd all learned that knowing the destination was irrelevant when you had no control over the journey. I was assigned a bunk in a chamber housing 500 soldiers, given a meal of ship rations that tasted like plasteel shavings, and expected to integrate into the ship's routine immediately. There were work details to be performed, training exercises to maintain combat readiness, endless inspections and formations, and bureaucratic requirements. The ship's commissars were different from the field commissars I'd known, more interested in uniform regulations and proper ritual observance than combat efficiency, though no less willing to execute for infractions. I performed my duties mechanically, attended the formations, passed the inspections, existed in the liminal space of transit with the same empty efficiency I'd brought to everything else. Time on the void ship was strange, disconnected from any natural rhythm. There were no days or nights in the conventional sense, just shift cycles marked by artificial lighting changes and the ringing of bells for different activities. I lost track of how long we'd been in transit, weeks or months. Impossible to tell. The warp drive made time unreliable anyway, stretching and compressing it in ways that defeated normal chronology. Sometimes I would experience what felt like days in what the chronometers insisted were hours. Other times, hours would vanish in what seemed like minutes. It was disorienting if you paid attention to it, so I stopped paying attention, just moving from task to task, shift to shift, existing in a perpetual present without past or future. The nightmares started during this period, though calling them nightmares wasn't quite accurate. They were more like replays. My sleeping mind, processing the accumulated experience of Tertius 9 by running through it again and again in exhaustive detail. I would dream of standing watch in the trenches, feeling the cold seep into my bones, hearing the whistle of incoming artillery. I would dream of the faces of men I'd killed, their expressions in the moment of death, their blood hot on my hands. I would dream of the chapel, of Father Mikol's blood on the Aquila, of Commissar de Lara's clinical diagnosis of my psychological death. The dreams were vivid and accurate, perfect recreations of memory, and I would wake, if waking was the right term for returning to consciousness, with no sense of relief that they were only dreams, because the dreams and reality had become indistinguishable. Other soldiers on the transport talked sometimes about what they'd been through, swapping stories of their campaigns, comparing horrors like collectors, trading rare items. I didn't participate in these conversations, having nothing to contribute beyond a recitation of facts that would mean nothing to anyone who hadn't been there. Tertius 9 was just another forgotten world, my experiences just another set of data points in the Imperium's vast catalogue of suffering. Nobody wanted to hear about it, and I had no desire to remember it in any more detail than my dreams already forced upon me. The ship's Medicae conducted examinations during transit, checking for disease or injury that might affect combat readiness at our destination. They looked at my cough, x-rayed my lungs, found extensive scarring, and probably the beginning stages of some kind of cancer. They looked at my shoulder, manipulated the joint, diagnosed severe degenerative damage. They catalogued my trench foot, my malnutrition, my damaged hands, my overall physical decline. Then they marked me as combat effective with limitations and sent me back to my bunk, because the Imperium's standards for combat effectiveness were low enough that I still qualified, despite barely being able to walk without pain. We'd been in transit for what I estimated to be 3 months when the alarms sounded throughout the ship. A klaxon that sent soldiers scrambling for their emergency stations. The vessel shuddered, a sensation like being struck by something massive, and the lights flickered. Over the Vox system, an officer's voice announced that we were experiencing a warp incursion, that Jella field integrity was compromised, that all personnel were to remain at their stations and await further orders. I sat on my bunk while the ship shook around me, while men prayed or screamed or sat in silent terror, while reality itself seemed to become uncertain. The warp was pressing against the ship's hull, trying to get in, and if the Geller fields failed completely, we would all die, or worse than die, our souls consumed by entities that existed in the spaces between thoughts. The incident lasted 6 hours, though time was even more unreliable than usual during that period. Men began seeing things that shouldn't have been there, shadows that moved independently of light sources, faces in the walls, whispers in languages that hurt to hear. Some broke, attacking their fellows or themselves, screaming about damnation and demons. The commissars executed the worst cases, bolt rounds bringing blessed silence to minds that had been shattered by glimpses of something human consciousness wasn't meant to process. I sat through it all with the same empty calm I brought to everything else, watching the chaos unfold around me with detached interest but no emotional investment. If the warp took me, it took me. If the Geller fields held, they held. Either way, it was beyond my control, and I'd long since surrendered any illusion of controlling my fate. The fields held. Eventually, the shuddering stopped, the whispers faded, the shadows returned to behaving like normal shadows. The Vox announced that the incursion had been contained, that we'd be proceeding to our destination, that the estimated casualties were within acceptable parameters. Acceptable to whom? They didn't specify. Certainly not acceptable to the 100+ soldiers who'd died during the incident, or the ones who'd been driven mad and executed, or the ones who'd survived but would never be quite right again, their minds permanently marked by what they'd seen in those hours when reality was thin. We made planetfall 2 weeks later, subjective time, probably meaningless in actual chronology on a world the briefing officers called Varsavia Secundus. It was, we were told, a hive world in rebellion, its population having rejected imperial authority and requiring pacification. Our regiment, reconstituted from the survivors of Tertius IX and other failed campaigns, was being deployed to assist in the siege of Hive Primus, the planet's primary population center. The briefing made it sound straightforward: surround the hive, cut it off from supplies, wait for them to surrender or starve. Simple, clean, nothing like the meat grinder of Tertius IX. I didn't believe it for a second. The Imperium didn't deploy damaged veterans to simple sieges. They deployed us where they expected heavy casualties, where our experience might buy some tactical advantage, where our deaths would be useful. Varsavia Secundus was going to be another Tertius IX, just with different scenery. The grind would continue, the machine would keep consuming soldiers, and I would keep functioning until I broke, because that was what I'd been made into, a component that operated until it failed catastrophically and was replaced by another equally disposable part. We deployed from the transport to the surface in a combat drop, loaded into drop pods that were essentially armored coffins fired at the planet like ammunition. The descent was violent, crushing G-forces that made breathing difficult. The pod's interior heated to the point where you could smell your own flesh beginning to cook. Then impact. The retro rockets firing at the last moment to slow us to survivable velocity. The pod slamming into the ground hard enough to crack teeth and rattle your brain inside your skull. The doors blew open with explosive bolts, smoke and hot air rushing in, and we scrambled out into Varsavia Secundus's toxic atmosphere, our rebreathers already in place, our weapons ready, expecting contact immediately. The hive loomed above us, a mountain of metal and rockcrete that rose into the polluted sky like a monument to human excess. Its outer walls were breached in dozens of places, battle damage from the initial assault that had begun the siege. We could see the rebel defenders on those walls, small figures firing down at our position, their shots mostly ineffective at this range, but deadly if you were unlucky. Our orders were to advance to the siege lines, join the regiments already in position, and prepare for the next phase of operations. Simple orders, almost certainly a prelude to massive casualties. I led my squad across the battlefield, through the wreckage of previous assaults, past burned-out vehicles and corpse fields that hadn't been cleared yet. The rebels had emplaced mines and booby traps throughout the approach zone, and we lost men to these unseen threats, soldiers stepping on buried explosives or triggering improvised devices that shredded them with shrapnel. The survivors learned to watch where they stepped, to look for the subtle signs of disturbance that indicated danger, to move with the careful precision of men walking through a room full of sleeping predators. The siege lines, when we reached them, were familiar in their misery trenches and bunkers arranged in concentric rings around the Hive, artillery emplacements pounding the walls at regular intervals, soldiers huddling in whatever shelter they could find, while the enemy fired back with weapons that ranged from las guns to much heavier ordnance. It was Tertius 9 again, just vertical instead of horizontal. The battle fought not across a ridgeline but up the side of a massive urban structure. The fundamentals were the same: hold your position, kill the enemy, die when your luck ran out. The scenery had changed, but the war was eternal, its nature unchanging regardless of location. I'd survived 18 months on Tertius 9 through a combination of skill, luck, and the gradual surrender of everything that made me human. Now, on Varsavia Secundus, I would continue to survive, or I would die, and either outcome was equally acceptable because I no longer had preferences about my existence. I was a weapon, properly calibrated, functioning according to design specifications, serving the Emperor's will, because that was my programming, and I had no capacity to question it. The Imperium would use me until I broke, then discard me and acquire a replacement, and this process would continue across millions of worlds for millions of soldiers until either humanity triumphed or was extinguished. This was the brutal reality of serving on a forgotten front, and then on the front after that, and the one after that, forever, until the body finally failed and you could rest. Not glory, not honor, just endurance, measured in the slow erosion of personhood, the systematic conversion of human beings into components of a machine too vast to comprehend. I'd learned this lesson on Tertius 9, paid for it with everything I'd been, and now I would apply that knowledge here, and wherever else they sent me, until there was nothing left to send. The Emperor protects, they told us. Perhaps he did, but he didn't protect us from ourselves, from what we became in his service, from the necessity of our own dehumanization. We protected the Imperium by becoming things that no longer needed protection, monsters made of meat and conditioning, void of mercy or hope, or any quality that might have made our existence meaningful. This was the price of humanity's survival, that those who defended it stopped being human themselves, became weapons that walked and talked and bled but lacked souls in any meaningful sense. I took my position on the firing step, checked my lasgun with the automatic precision of years of conditioning, and waited for the next assault to begin. It would come eventually, it always did, and I would fight, and men would die, and the war would continue, and none of it would matter except in the abstract calculus of Imperial strategy. This was what I'd become, what we'd all become. On Tertius 9 and every other forgotten front across the galaxy, ghosts haunting our own corpses, the living dead serving an immortal emperor, enduring because endurance was all that was left to us in this grim darkness where there was only war.